"Sir, I'm sorry, no ticket, no entry." Those words stopped Thomas Howard, a veteran, a father at the Grand Hall's door. He had driven through rain and pain, determined to see his son take the stage. Rules said he didn't belong. But then, a single voice, steady and commanding, spoke up from the past. What happened next silenced the whole room. Stay with us. This is a story of quiet dignity, hidden heroism, and a door opened by courage, not a ticket. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sun rose gently over the capital city, painting the streets in soft gold and warm light. Spring had arrived, and with it came a quiet sense of renewal, a gentle promise that today would be something more. Along the main avenue, flags waved softly in the breeze, catching hints of blue sky in their folds. Inside the Grand Hall, preparations hummed beneath crystal chandeliers and velvet ropes. The National Commendation Ceremony was the crown jewel of the year, an event that drew families from every corner of the country. Rows of polished wooden chairs gleamed beneath the lights, and the stage at the front was dressed in banners of red, white, and blue. It was a place of honor, a place where the best and brightest would be recognized for their dedication and spirit. For Thomas Howard, it was more than a ceremony. It was a chance to see his son, Ethan, stand tall under those lights, proof that every sacrifice and every silent promise had been worth it. Thomas rose early that morning, careful not to disturb the quiet of his small home. He stood in front of his old bedroom mirror, straightening the sleeves of a suit that had seen better days. It was a simple gray jacket, a little frayed at the cuffs, but it carried a dignity all its own. His medals, long tucked away, remained in a box beneath his bed. Today wasn't about him. Today was for Ethan. He paused for a moment, breathing deeply as the morning light washed over his face. In that quiet reflection, he saw not the lines of age, but the weight of years spent in service, years that had taught him both to stand proud and to stand humble. In the kitchen, the kettle whistled softly, and he poured a cup of black coffee. He held it between weathered hands, warming his fingers and his spirit. He thought of Ethan, of the young boy who used to run around the backyard in homemade capes and cardboard helmets. Now, that boy was a man about to be honored by the nation itself. The memory brought a soft smile to Thomas's lips, though it faded as he reached for his keys. A dull ache pulsed at the base of his skull, a reminder of old wounds, of a shrapnel scar that had never quite healed. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. This was just another battle, and he had never turned away from a fight that mattered. In a small apartment across town, Ethan was dressing in his pressed suit and carefully knotted tie. He ran a comb through his hair with deliberate precision, each stroke a quiet preparation for the day ahead. He paused by the window, looking out over the city skyline, and thought of his father. Ethan knew how hard Thomas had fought to be here, not just in the war, but in life itself. He knew the quiet dignity of a man who carried his burdens with grace, never asking for thanks, never seeking attention, and he wanted to make sure his father saw him on that stage, where every light and every eye would see the man he had become. As Thomas stepped outside, the air was crisp with early spring. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, feeling the weight of the day settle in his chest. The streets were alive with families heading in the same direction, each car a small vessel of pride and hope. The city felt electric, a current of anticipation running beneath the morning calm. He climbed into his old sedan, the seat creaking beneath him. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble, and he eased out onto the avenue. Traffic was already thick, horns bleating in the distance as police directed the flow. Thomas tapped the wheel lightly, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. There was still time, plenty of time. The miles passed slowly, each block a new challenge. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel, and every pause at a red light felt longer than the last. His mind wandered to the program folded neatly on the seat beside him, the one with Ethan's name printed in proud, bold letters. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over him, sharp and unwelcome. He blinked, gripping the wheel harder. The ache in his head pulsed, a dull throb that blurred the edges of the road. He forced a deep breath, willing his focus to return. He would not let this morning slip away. He would not let his son see an empty seat where he should have been. At a red light, he reached for his breast pocket, fingers patting gently for the stiff edge of his ticket, the small square of paper that held his place in the hall. His heart stopped for a moment when his pocket came up empty. He searched again, more urgently this time, hands fumbling through every fold and crease. Nothing. He pulled to the curb, his mind racing. He checked the glove box, the sun visor, the floor of the passenger seat. Still nothing. He closed his eyes, picturing the ticket lying on the small table by the door at home, left behind in the rush, in the haze of pain that had clouded his thoughts. The realization settled like a stone in his chest. No ticket, no invitation, no way inside. He leaned back against the seat, head resting against the worn headrest, and let the cold truth sink in. For a moment, he thought of turning back, of driving home, retrieving the slip of paper, and returning. But there wasn't time. There wasn't time for mistakes or regrets. Ethan was waiting, and Thomas had already waited a lifetime to see this day. He took another breath, steady and measured. He started the engine again and pulled back into traffic, merging with the slow crawl of cars headed toward the Grand Hall. His hands shook slightly on the wheel, but he kept them steady, 1 mile at a time, one breath at a time. As the building rose in the distance, columns of white stone and gleaming windows, Thomas felt a flicker of both awe and apprehension. He remembered the stories of men who had been turned away from places they belonged. He remembered the years he had spent fighting for the right to stand where others said he could not. He told himself this was different. This was his son, and nothing, no lost ticket, no closed door would keep him from seeing Ethan take his place in the world. He drove on, past lines of waiting cars and families bustling with excitement, past the whispers of, "I hope he sees me," and the quiet prayers of fathers who held their pride in silence. When he finally pulled up to the front of the hall, the marble steps gleamed in the bright morning light. He stepped out slowly, legs stiff from the drive, and paused for a moment to gather himself. The voices of ushers and security guards echoed in the air, mingling with the distant strains of music from inside. Thomas straightened his shoulders, brushed a hand over the lapel of his jacket, and took his first step toward the entrance. He had no ticket in his pocket, but he carried something else, something no paper could prove, and no policy could deny. He carried the weight of every promise he had ever made, and he would not be turned away from seeing it kept. The soft drizzle had turned to a steady rain by the time Thomas reached the main avenue. Cars crawled forward, bumper to bumper, and the windshield wipers beat a slow, rhythmic pulse. Each tap of rain against the glass felt like a countdown he couldn't stop. He clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the line of cars inched forward. A father with a daughter in a white dress smiled in the car beside him, oblivious to the storm gathering behind Thomas's eyes. The dashboard clock glowed with each passing minute, and Thomas could feel the weight of every second slipping through his fingers. He tried to calm his breathing, to keep his focus sharp, but the ache in his head flared again, a low hum that wouldn't be silenced. He blinked hard, refusing to let it take hold. Today wasn't about pain, it was about Ethan, about seeing his boy take a place of honor that Thomas had always dreamed of for him. The rain blurred the world outside, turning streetlights into smears of gold and white. Thomas turned up the heater, but the chill wouldn't leave his bones. He thought of the ticket he'd left behind, sitting useless on the kitchen table. A single scrap of paper that meant everything in a world ruled by ceremony. The traffic finally broke near the Grand Hall. Thomas turned into the lot, the tires crunching over gravel, and pulled to a stop. He stepped out into the damp morning, his breath clouding in the cold air. The building loomed above him, columns of white stone lit by spotlights, banners flapping in the breeze like quiet applause. Thomas took a moment, standing beneath the arch of the entrance. He felt small against the grandeur of it all, a man in a worn suit, carrying nothing but hope in his heart. He brushed a hand over his brow, feeling the scar beneath his hairline throb in the cold. Inside, the echoes of an orchestra tuning drifted through the doors. Laughter and polite conversation wove around him, families greeting one another with careful smiles. Thomas approached the main entrance, shoulders squared, determined to cross the threshold. A security guard in a crisp uniform stopped him with a raised hand. "Ticket, sir," the guard said, his tone polite but firm. Thomas reached instinctively for his breast pocket before remembering the empty space there. He looked into the guard's eyes and saw only duty staring back. "I left it at home," Thomas said, his voice calm but tight. "My son Ethan Howard, he's being honored today. Please, I just need to see him." The guard's expression didn't change. His eyes flickered to the lines of guests arriving behind Thomas, then back to the older man in the rain-streaked coat. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said. "No ticket, no entry. It's policy." Thomas took a breath, trying to steady the trembling in his hands. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I fought for this country," he said. "I've never asked for anything, but I'm asking you now. Let me see my son." The guard shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I can't make exceptions." Thomas swallowed hard. He stepped back, feeling the rejection press into his chest like a weight. Around him, families passed by without a glance, polished shoes and warm laughter, moving past the man who had given so much. He turned away from the door, his breath catching in his throat. The light from the hall spilled onto the marble steps, bright and unyielding. Thomas found a quiet corner by the entrance, leaning against the cold stone wall. His shoulders slumped, the weight of years and wars pressing down on him. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, a memory flickered. A dusty road in a country far from home, the crack of gunfire, the searing pain in his shoulder as he dragged a wounded brother to safety. He remembered the taste of dust and fear, the way the world had narrowed to the single task of survival. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in the present, back in the place he had always hoped to be, yet still standing outside. Thomas pressed a hand to his forehead, feeling the pulse of that old wound echo in the beat of his heart. He had survived that day. He had carried those memories in silence. But now, when he needed only a single chance to stand with his son, the door was closed. He shifted his weight, glancing through the tall glass doors at the world inside. Chandeliers glittered above rows of polished seats. Ushers moved with quiet precision, guiding guests to their places. At the center of it all was the stage, bathed in light, waiting for Ethan. Thomas took another breath, steadying the ache in his chest. He could see Ethan's name on the program in his mind, could almost hear the applause that would greet him. He refused to let the locked door be the end of this day. He had learned long ago that sometimes the only thing left was to stand your ground and bear witness. So he stayed by the wall, his coat damp and his heart pounding. The world inside moved without him, but he was there, watching. He found a narrow gap between the doors where he could see the edge of the stage. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He leaned against the cool stone, feeling the rough surface beneath his palm. He thought of the promises he had made to Ethan when the boy was young, promises to be there. No matter how hard or how far, he would keep that promise, even if he had to watch from the shadows. The murmur of the crowd inside rose and fell, the soft music of an orchestra drifting out to where Thomas stood. He let the sounds wash over him, grounding himself in the moment. Every note was a step closer to Ethan's name being called. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music carry him back through the years, back to nights when he had held Ethan close, singing him to sleep with a quiet voice that carried every hope he had ever held. Back to days when he had taught his son to ride a bike, to tie his shoes, to stand tall even when the world tried to bend him low. Thomas opened his eyes again, the present waiting for him. He shifted his weight, ignoring the stiffness in his knees, and kept his gaze fixed on the narrow view he had claimed. He wouldn't let it slip away. Not today. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle mist, the world hushed and gray. Thomas felt the damp seeping into his coat, but he didn't move. He had faced worse than cold and rain. He had faced nights so dark he had thought he might never see morning again. This was just another storm to endure. Inside the hall, the lights dimmed, and the hush of anticipation fell like a gentle weight over the crowd. Thomas watched as the first names were called. Each one met with polite applause. He stood a little straighter, every nerve in his body waiting for the moment when Ethan's name would echo in that space. He could almost feel the warmth of the room, the pride that must be in Ethan's heart. And he hoped no. He knew that Ethan would feel his presence, even from the other side of the glass. Because some bonds can't be measured by distance or tickets or rules. They're measured by the quiet conviction of a man who will not turn away. Thomas let the faint glow of the chandeliers guide his gaze, each light a promise that this day would not be taken from him. He stayed there, breath slow and sure, determined to see it through. Because in the end, it wasn't about where he sat. It was about being there, being the witness to a moment he had waited a lifetime to see. Thomas stood quietly at the edge of the grand entrance, shoulders squared even as his heart pounded against his ribs. The soft hush of the crowd inside pressed against the glass, a warm echo of a world that had almost left him behind. He didn't mind the cold or the rain anymore. He had learned long ago that some moments were worth every ache. He was so focused on the stage on that narrow view through the doors that he didn't notice the man who had stopped just a few feet behind him. The man's steps were measured, deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of a lifetime. A uniform gleamed beneath the hall's lights, the gold of an admiral's insignia catching in the glow. Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder, a touch that was both gentle and firm, grounding him in the present. He turned, startled, and met the eyes of Admiral William Carter. The man was older now, his hair gone silver, but the steel in his gaze was unchanged from the days when they had stood together in darker places. "Thomas Howard," the Admiral said softly, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "It's been a long time." Thomas blinked, words catching in his throat. Memories flooded back in an instant. The crack of gunfire, the smell of earth and sweat, the night he had carried Carter out of the line of fire with nothing but his own strength and a promise. "Admiral," Thomas managed, his voice low and a little unsteady. I didn't expect to see you here." The Admiral's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "And I didn't expect to find you standing outside, like a stranger." "You have no ticket." Thomas shook his head, swallowing the bitterness of the admission. "I left it behind," he said quietly. "The pain, it got to me this morning. I forgot." His hand brushed against the worn lapel of his coat, a silent apology he didn't know how to give. Admiral Carter's eyes softened as he looked at the man who had once carried him through hell. "Thomas," he said, his voice firm, "you don't need a ticket. You earned your place in there long before today." A hush fell between them, filled only by the gentle patter of rain on the marble steps. The young security guard who had turned Thomas away shifted awkwardly, glancing between them with a flicker of doubt. "Sir, the policy," he began, but Carter held up a hand, silencing him with a look. "This man," Carter said, turning to face the guard, his tone clear and unwavering, "is the reason I'm standing here today. He didn't just fight for this country, he saved the men who would one day build it back up. You will let him pass." The guard hesitated, eyes darting to Thomas, then to the steady gaze of the Admiral. In that quiet moment, Thomas saw the flicker of something in the young man's face, understanding, maybe even a kind of awe. Slowly, the guard stepped aside, lowering his clipboard without a word. Carter turned back to Thomas, his expression softening. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and resolute. "You've stood outside long enough." Thomas hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then he nodded, his breath catching in his chest as he fell in step beside the Admiral. They moved together, the doors of the grand hall opening before them with a quiet sigh. The warm glow of chandeliers washed over Thomas's face, and he blinked against the sudden brightness. For a moment, he felt small beneath the vast arch of the ceiling, but Carter's presence at his side steadied him. Inside, the ceremony had already begun. The hall was filled with dignitaries and families, every seat occupied by someone who had come to bear witness to the promise of a new generation. The music swelled softly as names were called. Each one met with polite applause. Thomas kept his eyes on the stage, his heart thudding in time with the music. He could see Ethan standing among the others, waiting for his name to be spoken. The young man looked calm, his posture straight, but Thomas knew his son's heart better than anyone. He knew the pride there, the quiet determination that had carried Ethan forward through every challenge. They reached the edge of the seating area, and Carter gestured to the front row, the place of honor Thomas had once thought forever out of reach. "This is your seat," the Admiral said quietly. Thomas hesitated, the words almost too much to take in, but before he could protest, Carter laid a hand on his shoulder, firm and gentle. "You've carried enough for a lifetime," he said. "Let yourself be seen." Thomas nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle into his chest. He moved forward, each step careful and measured, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The carpet beneath his feet was soft, the air filled with the murmur of voices and the gentle hum of anticipation. He didn't see the curious glances that followed him as he took his place in the front row. He didn't hear the whispered questions or the rustle of programs. His eyes were fixed on the stage, where Ethan stood with his head held high. And then, the moment came. The announcer stepped to the microphone, his voice warm and clear. "Ethan Howard," he said, and the name echoed through the hall like a quiet blessing. Thomas watched as his son stepped forward, the light catching the fine lines of his face, the determination in his eyes. Ethan took the small medal in his hands, his fingers closing around it with quiet reverence. He turned, ready to bow his head and accept the applause. But something in his gaze shifted. He lifted his eyes and saw his father standing there, not in the shadows, but in the place of honor. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. Ethan's breath caught in his chest, and he took a single step back from the podium. The applause faltered, the murmur of the crowd fading into a hush that was almost holy. Slowly, Ethan descended the steps of the stage, the medal still in his hand. His footsteps were deliberate, measured, as he crossed the floor to where Thomas sat. The young man's eyes shone with something that no stage light could match. He stopped in front of Thomas and reached out, his voice low and unwavering. "Dad," he said, and the word was both a question and a promise. Thomas looked up, his breath shaking in his chest. "Today is about you," Ethan said, his voice carrying to the far corners of the hall. "If there's anyone who deserves this seat, this honor, it's you." The silence that followed was the kind that comes before something true. And then, a single pair of hands began to clap slow and deliberate, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in the vast hall. Others joined in, the applause swelling until it filled the room. Thomas felt his eyes sting with tears he hadn't let himself shed. He rose slowly, taking his son's hand in his own, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs like something both heavy and holy. The two men stood together, father and son, no longer separated by doors or tickets or rules. The applause rose higher, a wave of sound that washed over them and made the chandeliers above them tremble. Thomas closed his eyes for a breath, letting it wash over him, letting it remind him that some things cannot be denied. Not courage, not love, not the quiet dignity of a man who had never stopped believing in what mattered most. Ethan's hand was steady as he guided his father to the front row, the applause still echoing like a river of gratitude through the hall. Thomas's steps were slow but sure, every movement carrying a quiet weight that no one could miss. Around them, the faces of strangers turned soft, eyes filled with a respect that needed no words. They reached the seat, the one that had been reserved for someone else, someone with a name on a list and a ticket in hand. But today, no one asked to see that ticket. The world had shifted in the space of a single breath, and now it made room for the man who had carried his duty long before any program was printed. Thomas sank into the seat with a careful breath, feeling the plush cushion beneath him, the warmth of a place that finally felt like it belonged to him. His hands trembled slightly in his lap, the weight of years pressing gently into the fabric of his coat. But his gaze was steady, his shoulders squared with the quiet dignity of a man who had never asked for anything but a chance to stand by his son. The orchestra resumed softly, strings humming a gentle melody that seemed to wrap around the silence like a promise. Ethan stepped back onto the stage, his steps no longer the measured pace of someone who had something to prove. He carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had just learned what it meant to honor those who came before him. At the podium, Ethan paused. The bright lights glowed around him, but his voice was calm and even. "I came here today ready to accept an honor," he said, his words carrying to every corner of the hall. "But I've learned that the real honor has been beside me my whole life." There was a hush, the kind that settles deep in the chest and holds every breath. Ethan looked down at his father, eyes bright and unashamed. "This man," he said, "taught me that dignity isn't something you wear on a medal or a plaque. It's in the way you show up for the people you love, the way you keep standing, even when the world tries to tell you to sit down." Thomas didn't look away. His eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe the tears. He let them be a testament to the weight of the moment, to the simple truth that some victories aren't measured in applause, but in the quiet relief of being seen. Ethan lifted the small medal he'd been given, its metal gleaming under the stage lights. He held it for a breath, then turned and carried it down from the podium. The applause rose again, a gentle wave that filled the hall with warmth and the hush of reverence. He reached his father and pressed the medal into Thomas's hand. "This is he said softly, his voice cracking just a little. "It always was." Thomas closed his fingers around the medal, feeling the cool metal and the weight of love that had come with it. He nodded, a single, grateful motion. Ethan turned back to the stage, but he didn't look nervous anymore. His shoulders were relaxed, his steps sure. When he took the microphone again, his voice carried with it a strength that had nothing to do with the ceremony and everything to do with the man in the front row. "For years," he said, "my father carried the weight of his past quietly. He didn't ask to be recognized. He didn't ask for applause. But today, you've given him that moment, and I thank you for it." The hall was quiet, the applause fading to a gentle murmur of agreement. Thomas sat back, his hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. The program continued, each name called and celebrated. But for Thomas, the ceremony had already reached its peak. He let himself breathe, let the music wash over him like a balm. In that moment, he didn't feel like the outsider anymore. He didn't feel like the man without a ticket or a place to sit. He felt like a father, like a veteran, like someone who had given all he had, and finally been seen for it. The speeches wound on, words of promise and ambition, but Thomas heard them all with a quiet heart. Each one felt like an echo of his own journey of the long road he had walked to get here, and the silent prayers he had whispered along the way. As the final notes of the ceremony faded into the hush of the closing moments, Ethan stepped down from the stage one last time. He moved to his father's side, not as a speaker or a graduate, but simply as a son. Thomas looked up at him and smiled a small, weary smile that said everything without a single word. The two men rose together, standing side by side as the crowd began to disperse. Around them, people chatted in low voices, gathering coats and programs, but no one asked to see a ticket or a name on a list. They simply stepped aside, making room for the quiet power of a man who had earned his place by living with honor, not by holding a piece of paper. As they stepped out of the hall into the cool air of the evening, Thomas felt the last of the day's tension slip from his shoulders. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath a sky that was just beginning to clear. He breathed in deeply, the air fresh and full of promise. Ethan walked beside him, one hand resting lightly on his father's back. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice low and full of things that didn't need to be spoken. Thomas nodded, his throat too tight to answer, but his hand closed over the medal in his pocket, holding it close to his heart. They walked together down the marble steps, the quiet murmur of the crowd fading behind them. Thomas didn't feel the ache in his knees or the slow thrum of old pain in his shoulder. He felt only the warmth of the moment, the steady weight of his son's hand, and the simple truth that today, he had been given more than he ever asked for. In a world of doors and rules and careful lines, it was this small, unbreakable bond that carried him forward. A quiet reminder that sometimes, the only thing you need to open the door that's been closed to you is the memory of every promise you ever kept. And in that promise, in that unwavering love, the world finally found its way to honor the quiet hero it almost forgot. Thomas Howard walked away from that hall with nothing but his dignity and a single medal in his pocket. But that was enough, because for him and for Ethan, it was never about the ticket. It was about the heart that had never stopped believing. And today, the world had seen it too. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.